Good to see all of you this morning. We announced a few weeks ago that we were going to begin, as soon as we finished our study of the book of Titus, which we did on Wednesday, that we were going to begin a study of the book of Revelation. I guess the first admission that maybe I need to make is I don't necessarily feel or consider myself the most qualified individual to cover this book. There are a lot of smarter people than me out there that could cover this book in a better way. And I'll have to depend on those people, whether it be books and things that I can read and things that I can listen to. One of the things that I have access to that I would be glad to share with anyone, if you're interested in it, just let me know. And I know some of the folks that were already studying this have used this, but I have. Some of you may remember the name Homer Haley. Homer Haley was a preacher from years ago, and anyway, Homer Haley did a book on the book of Revelation, and then he also he taught it at Florida College, and then he taught it from various churches and places that he went. He would teach a series of classes on the book. He would cover it in a short span of time, a lot faster than we'll probably cover it, but in a certain amount of lessons. But anyway, long story short, if you would like to hear him teach the book, which will be better than me teaching the book, I can give you those audio CDs if you'd like to have a copy of them. And it may be good for you if you're interested, just to give you something to kind of think about. And he'll give you different perspectives, obviously, than I would give you. And so that's one resource that I have available to you. There are other workbooks and things that we could have used. Probably, in my humble opinion, the most simplified workbook to use is probably the one that Weldon Warnick put together. It's a very simplified approach towards the book of Revelation, but it's a good resource that you're interested in. I can point you in a direction where you can pick that up. And there's lots of pieces of knowledge out there. And this is one of those studies where we're kind of going to have to depend on that and get some insight and help as we study the book, but also just let the book speak for itself and maybe not overthink it sometimes and not get caught up in it. And so that's kind of one of the things that I wanted to share as we started. Before I get too much further, does anyone need a copy of the lesson sheets that we handed out on Wednesday night? If you need a copy, just raise your hand. Kevin's got them in his hands back there in the back. He can bring you a copy. I mentioned to you Wednesday that I'm going to give this material to you in sections. If I gave you the material for the whole thing, I think it was like 129 pages from start to finish. And so rather than give you the whole thing in one lump and not have any way you'd have to hole punch it or find a notebook for it or something because you can't staple it, I'm just going to give it to you in sections in a normal way. But if you'd like a full set, if you'd like to have from start to finish the full set and put it in your own notebook or something like that, just let me know and I'll be glad to get you the whole study. But otherwise, I'll just kind of, as we get closer to the next section, it'll be available to you to pick up as we get closer. Because if you notice within the material that I gave you, that he kind of breaks it down that way. He gives us, here's a section in section 2 and section 3, and so that'll allow us to kind of take a little bit of that approach. Let me share with you, before we get into his introduction, in terms of the lesson sheets that I gave you, let me give you a couple of thoughts that kind of govern my approach towards the book. There's a premise I think we all have to kind of acknowledge right off the bat. And that is that we're not going to understand all the pictures and symbols. Not all of them. We can draw some fair conclusions about much of the pictures and symbols. But it's going to be hard for us to be able to draw perfect conclusions about all the symbols and the pictures that are being drawn. Let me illustrate that to you, by the way. If I use the phrase before you this morning, fine as frog's hair, why would somebody say that is fine as frog's hair? Okay, so do frogs have hair? See, but you've heard the phrase, right? And you've never heard anybody say the phrase, I am not older than you, Sarah. If you raise your hand if you've heard that phrase, fine as frog's hair. Anybody know what it means? right? But you just kind of assumed it meant something, right? We do that in language sometimes. We create phrases, symbols, pictures, and sometimes they have meaning, and sometimes they have odd meaning because I would assume maybe they do. Maybe the frog's hair is so perfectly fine. I don't know. I haven't studied it. But the point is, there are things you hear even on a daily basis. Symbols, pictures, sarcasm. I'm not saying the revelation is a sarcasm, but there are things that you hear on a regular basis that you may or may not be able to draw a detailed reason why did they use that phrase, but you kind of know what it meant, right? If you hear it. And so there's going to be those moments where we may not be able to dissect and perfectly understand the symbol, the picture. Why did he use that picture? Why, why a dragon? Why a beast? Why a number? Why? We may not always be able to ascertain exactly the why the revelator records for us some specific symbol. But we can understand the message of the book of Revelation. And that's what I want you to be focused on. That's what I want to be focused on as we study this book. Is though I may not be able to ascertain specific, perfect detail, I can understand what the book's about. I can understand its meaning. I can understand why it would be written. I can understand the purpose that was behind it. And I can glean the benefit of the knowledge that's revealed within it if I'm willing to accept that there's a core message and not get lost in the picture. Sometimes if we get lost in the pictures, we forget what the message is about. If you were to try to sum up the book, what would you say that this book is about? Yeah, it's about victory. Christ wins. I don't know how else to say it. That's what the book's about. What do people who are being challenged, persecuted, are facing hardships? What do they need to hear? They need to hear there's answer, there's victory, there's resolve. God can take care of this. You may have to be patient, but God's going to deal with the victory. And that ultimate victory is found in Jesus. And so we need to appreciate that about the book of Revelation, that it does have a core message. And it's not, in many senses, it isn't all that speculative thought that men have created in relationship to it. Really, the core message is very simple. Jesus wins over all things. And it will illustrate how the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, is superior to all things. And that's really the message that should jump off the page at us as we study through this book. And so be careful, and I'll try to be careful, to not run a million miles to where we really could have gotten the thought and the message from the first quarter mile. So we'll try our best to be careful about those kinds of things. All right, jump to his introduction. If you're looking at it, he breaks down, you can scroll way ahead. He breaks down his table of contents all the way through, and he's talking about all the different things. I don't know that I'm going to read through all that. You can read that on your own if you want to see how he breaks the book down. I want you to scroll into where it says introduction at the top of your page, just like I have it on the screen. Because there's a couple of words, and as we introduce this book this morning, there's a couple of things that we want to at least consider for a moment to make sure we have a basic picture of. You're going to hear a word used maybe a good bit in relationship to this study, and that's apocalyptic. Somebody tell me what the word apocalyptic means. Okay, it may mean revelation by straight. Okay, so then what does that mean in relationship to our study? Okay, so when we talk about apocalyptic language, we're talking about a revelation that generally is revealed through signs, symbols, pictures. Also, the idea of apocalyptic language generally refers to the end of something. It's a reference to whether it be the complete end or the end of some challenge, but it has the idea of addressing how something's going to end or have a conclusion. And so you see that in apocalyptic literature. Within the Old Testament, there's basically how many books that deal in that kind of way? There are 3. There's Daniel, there's Ezekiel, and then Zechariah. Those were the 3 in the Old Testament that addressed the idea of this apocalyptic language. And Daniel's probably the most familiar to us in terms of use, because we talk about Daniel because of the accounts that happen in the first part of the book of Daniel. We're more familiar with the book of Daniel, more so because of Daniel in the lion's den and about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace and all those. But the latter part of the book of Daniel uses the same kinds of pictures and languages that you'll see in the book of Revelation. Ezekiel is a book that gives the same kind of language and pictures that the book of Revelation will use at times, and Zechariah the same. So those are the 3 Old Testament books that sometimes, as we go through different segments, that we'll have to refer back to maybe, and it'll help us potentially get an understanding of why was it written that way in the book of Revelation when we see the way they wrote those apocalyptic languages back in the Old Testament books as well. Yeah. And too deep to wade through in some ways in the class, but there will be, it would behoove all of us as we go through this study to also include some reading and some work in those Old Testament books. It would strongly benefit the overall study of the book of Revelation. So, jump down where he says methods of interpretation, and that's always a scary word to us. But the idea of how do we understand this book? How can we draw conclusions about this book? And the truth is, there are various viewpoints, and depending on the viewpoint, you can kind of draw some various meanings and thoughts out of the particulars that you'll find in this book. He labels in the workbook, the worksheets that we gave you, he labels 5. I guarantee you there's more than 5. Okay, there's more than 5 views among men of how to go about understanding this book. He labels 5. They are the basis of many others as well. But some argue that this is a futurist book. The book basically describes events which immediately precede the second coming of Christ. Those are the ones that have led to the most speculative kinds of thoughts, where it takes almost the entire book of Revelation and points it all towards the second coming of Jesus, as if it had no direct correlation to the folks it was actually written to. That it's all future. That it all has something to do with events that will occur at the coming of Christ. And I think that we'll see when you just start the narrative in the very first chapter, you'll see that phrase that these things that must shortly come to pass is a defining moment in the book. And it kind of takes this futuristic approach out of the picture when the writer himself records for us that he's talking about things that aren't coming at the very end of things. Because you think about the second coming, that you can't. How can you at the end of all things, at the second coming of Christ, how can something shortly come to pass but refer to the last thing that will ever happen? That kind of language just doesn't meet. And so the futurist view is probably what a lot of people adopt, but not necessarily consistent, as we'll see as we study through. There are some who talk about this continuous historical. Basically, the book foretells events from John's writing to the end of time. And so he's kind of unfolding history in a sense. The problem is that has led a lot of men to try to take certain pieces of that and attribute it to certain moments in history. What's interesting about that kind of approach to me has always been the fact that it's pretty easy, isn't it, to let history happen and then take something and say, oh, that must have meant this. That's a totally different thing than a prophet who says something's going to occur. When you're able to look back at history and say, "Whoa, maybe this meant that," or maybe this. Once it's already happened, it's pretty easy to kind of take that thought and just kind of make it attributed to something. So there's a lot of dangerous kind of thinking that can happen if we view this book as just John trying to tell us the history of man from the time he wrote until the end of time. It allows for a whole lot of guesswork and speculative thought when you look at it that way. There's the philosophy of history. The symbols and pictures described represent forces rather than real events and people. And so, in other words, it's more generic. It talks about power and forces and things rather than specifics as it relates to how history is going to unfold. The preterist, or the book was written and fulfilled in John's day. That implies that everything about the book happened, fulfilled, finished, completed in the days of John. And then there's the historical background look that says the book was written for people in John's day with principles applicable to the end of time. And as the author of the workbook states on his own behalf, and I concur, that is the predominant thinking I have about this book. That the book was written for the people in the days of John. When that phrase, these things that must shortly come to pass, he specifically addresses it to whom? Those seven churches of Asia, okay? Not just chapters 2 and 3. I think you'll find that the message itself is going out to these churches, these people who are going to receive it. And so it has very specific and direct meaning to the people who received the letter and the information that was found within it. And so, though there may be applicable lessons to be learned, though there may be some things that are referenced within the book that may apply to us in some ways and may apply to some future events, ultimately the book was written for them and then for us to learn from. Not written for us and for them to know ahead of time what benefit we're going to gain. When you think about it in that picture. And so, I concur with his thought processes that basic premise is probably important in the study. And you'll find that that's the way I'll look at most of the things that we see. That it had a particular specific meaning to the people it was originally written to, and then we gain application like we did. And the truth of the matter is that's important, in my estimation, for this reason. It helps dissolve away some of all that speculative thought and where people try to read between the lines and put their own kind of spin on what it may or may not mean in future tenses. Anybody can do that, right? Anybody can kind of look at something and try to make it fit. But if we kind of focus our attention on the fact that this first and foremost had to have had meaning to the people that received it, it'll help us understand it moving forward. It had to have had some meaning to them first. And not everything that you would say to one group is specifically applicable to another group. You might have a place where Judaizing teachers were prominent, and so the teachings that happen in that location from the apostles may focus on that. There may be another place that isn't embattled by those things, but they're embattled by something else. And so the nature of what's written to them is specific to their issues. And it is important for us to maintain that kind of focus in terms of the message. And there is some of that here, I believe, where the thought process of a need to write it in such a way that it wouldn't be so blatant that it would be withheld and hindered in terms of its flow. And I think we'll see some of that as we move forward in the study. Any other thoughts or questions about those basic viewpoints towards the book? And you can balance a little bit. I think that a lot of the things that he's talking about have some fulfillment and specific applications to those that it was written to. So you may at times blend a little bit of these things, but for the most part, we'll probably take that historical background perspective towards our study as we move forward. Then there's the second issue that makes it hard, and that is the timing of the writing. And there are scholarly people on both sides of this discussion. In my pursuit of, I was looking for something that I could use that was reproducible for our class, rather than buying, 100 workbooks at a heavy cost. I was trying to find something that I could just print and allow us to use. And in that pursuit, I was surprised to find that even among preachers that I know, there were varying thought processes as to the date of the book when it was written, and what, depending on which date you pick, it'll change who you think the focus of attention is on, but it doesn't necessarily change the message that's happening within the book. And so though I take a particular position on when I believe it was written, I also am willing to acknowledge that what's interesting is if you take these materials, you got these from these different fellows that in some argue that the book was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the pictures of the persecutions that were coming are pictures that point to the challenges that the Jews were going to experience leading into 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. That has a whole other set of problems that can arise from that theory, and because generally, and not the guys I was reading from, by the way, they just kind of took the position of that's when of the date of the writing. They didn't go the next step, but some have, where they've actually placed the resurrection having occurred in 70 AD, and they use a lot of the pictures that are referenced here in the book of Revelation in order to take that position. And so there has to be some caution if you take that early date, if that we don't extrapolate it into positions that don't necessarily fit the whole of what Scriptures teach. But if you looked at that material, barring any of that 70 AD doctrine, the message comes out the same. The points that are made come out the same, irregardless of which date. I generally take the idea that this came at a later date, that we're dealing with the persecution that came by the hands of the Romans. Domitian, most likely here, there was a Roman emperor at the time, in somewhere in 81 to 96, and the purpose, the focus, is to encourage the Christians who are facing some pretty severe challenges. Not all of them, by the way, because we'll see when we talk to those specific messages to those churches of Asia that some of them felt like everything was what? Just fine and dandy, right? He said it isn't. You're not in the condition you think you are. And so not everybody was facing, but it is a challenge of that time. And most folks that I have read from take this date or this timing and frame the book of Revelation under the idea that it happened under this Roman persecution, and it is written in a way that Christians could grasp the concept of the teachings that are within it without drawing unnecessary attention to themselves in relationship to the Roman Empire and the difficulties that could come from that, as if they needed any more hardship coming from Rome at that point in time, and how it is they need to be steadfast and maintain the truth and be righteous and remain sturdy through those kinds of challenges. And that message can push forward to any people. The message of steadfastness and faithfulness and maintaining levels of righteousness and truth, regardless of the persecution or the challenges of the time, is a message that is true and good for folks from then till now and forever, to maintain that kind of faithfulness. So that's how we'll kind of pull applications as we move forward in the book itself. That's how we'll gain insight to how these things benefit us. Well, and I think there is, and Bob mentioned that there is some picture here where you're hoping that they'll grasp what's being said without necessarily somebody else's eyes being able to understand those things.
And again, Brian, they should have been able to grasp those signs and symbols if they had read the prophets previously.
Yeah. Which had been and keep in mind either date, by the way, you're early enough that the biggest focus of attention on religious thought had been coming from the Old Testament law and the prophets. The bulk of what they knew about anything still at this point had come from those sources. The New Testament is being written. We're at the end of those writings, but they're just now starting to be circulated among more and more people. And so hopefully their background in understanding of Old Testament literature would help them understand the pictures that are being drawn. Whereas somebody who's had no contact and relationship to the Old Testament or anything else from God for that matter may not be able to ascertain what's being said.
What about the predominantly Gentile Christians? Would they have been given enough Old Testament background?
And that's where they like us would have to depend on somebody that had. You know what I mean? In gaining the insight that are there. But you're right. There has to be some ability to draw some conclusions. But the style, for lack of a better description, hopefully would enable them to grasp the meanings that were there. So the theme of the book is the victory of Christ. And we mentioned that at the beginning of our study. And notice this quote from the book. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for He is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with Him are called chosen and faithful, from Revelation 17, verse 14. There's a battle going on. And that battle, though at times has some physical consequences, is a spiritual battle. It's a battle over souls. It's a battle over eternal condition. It's a battle over good and evil. And the book is going to focus on the idea that good will win. Christ will win. Even when it looks like it's hopeless. Even when it looks like we're being slaughtered and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. How is it possible that there's going to be any victory? How are we going to be able to draw victory out of it? That's the motivation of the book. Is how can victory come despite all the evil that seems to be prevalent? Sound familiar, by the way? Yeah. It's the same thing we've been saying since the days of these folks in the 7 churches of Asia. That mindset hasn't changed. How are we going to overcome all the evil that is around us? The Bible tells us that evil men and sin waxes worse and worse. But the sins of man have been around forever. almost forever. From the time that man chose sin, sin's been a problem. It became such a problem in the days of Noah that God said, I'm restarting this. I'm restarting. Evil and sin have been around for a long, long time. We're going to talk a little bit. I don't get into my sermon already, but we'll talk about that in the sermon this morning here in just a little while. But it's hard sometimes when you see evil seem to reign, and when you see sin seem to always have the upper hand and always seem to be in charge. It's hard to even convince ourselves that how in the world are we going to have any victory in this? How is it possible? That's what this book's going to do. It's going to tell us to have confidence in the Christ. And you'll use all kinds of pictures of power and symbolism of authority to remind us that the ultimate authority is God and His Son, and that there is always enough power within them to do whatever they desire to achieve and accomplish. And we'll see that as we move forward. Ultimately, victory in Christ is the picture that we'll see. Let's look real quick at the symbolism of numbers, because there are going to be a lot of numbers. It can be challenging when you see because we generally think of numbers to mean amounts, quantities. We're taught, right, mathematical teaching that numbers mean numbers. But in symbolic, apocalyptic teaching, they don't always have a specific number in mind. They have a concept, a principle in mind. Over the years, scholars have looked and tried to examine various types of literature and tried to come up with some kind of understanding of what these numbers might mean, and then how that can help us understand why they're used in the fashion they are in the book of Revelation. And so here are some of the numbers you'll see. You see the number 1. And generally when you think of 1, you think of what? Unity. 1, singular. Okay? A singular idea. Father, let them be one as you and I are one. That was the prayer of Jesus, right? Unity. And Jesus even uses the number 1 to illustrate the concept of unity among people. Sometimes you might see the number 2 representing the strength as 2 witnesses or disciples sent out 2 by 2. You see at times that number being used. If you remember, it was at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses that somebody would be allowed to be held accountable for something. When Jesus sent His disciples out, He sent them together. He sent them 2 by 2. And so it represents the idea of there's some strength here. There's some validity to what's happening when there are 2. 3 is often thought of as a divine number, as in the Godhead, or God as in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit. And so when you see that number come up, there's some reference there. The number 4, you think of a world number as the 4 corners of the earth, and it's been depicted that way. Even in the vision that Peter had, if you recall, he saw it come down and teaching him that nothing was unclean, and it was a global kind of picture because it has these 4 corners, and so you see that number in that reference. 6 is typically thought of as a human number because it's 1 less than the perfect number. Generally, you think they use 7 as that which is perfect and complete. And that imagery has been around for at least since the days of the Sabbath, right? When you have since the days of creation, and you had 7 days to create, last day of rest in that picture. So from the days of creation, we've had this imagery of it's complete, it's finished. And so the number 7 referring to the perfect number, a complete number, then 1 under that, imperfect, man. I was hoping to wait at least 2 or 3 classes before we do. But there, but we'll get there. But you're right. He is completely imperfect. And if there was a number associated with him, it would certainly be an imperfect number. Is that fair enough answer? Yeah. Yeah. So there can be some picture related there too. 10 represents complete power, as the 10 horns, the 10 diadems that we'll see when we get into the narrative. And then finally, 12. If you say 12 in relationship to the Bible, there's basically two pictures that come to mind, are there not? The 12 tribes and 12 apostles, right? We generally think of 12 then as a religious number that relates to the number God used in terms of defining His people in really both testaments. The focus of those 12 tribes under that Old Testament system, and then the focus of the work of those 12 apostles in the New Testament system, and the appreciation of those things. Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you see that multiplication side of this, probably what we'll see is the intensity, or a, for lack of a better term, of trying to show even a bigger picture. If it's power we're talking about, or whatever it is, you do a multiplication to show it at its highest peak, if you will, when you use a multiplying number of a symbolic number.
One example of that would be you get into chapter 4 and chapter 5, you're going to see the number 24 elders.
Yeah.
A multiplicity of the number
12. Yep. Any other thoughts? Questions about the introduction? We got about a minute and a half. Quickly, I'm just going to run through because we'll do it. We'll just look real quick at the division of the book as he sees it, so that you get a picture of how we're going to look at this. But you'll see that earthly struggle, the church being persecuted in those early chapters, and the definitions and thoughts that will go along with that. You'll get then to a more spiritual background when you move forward from about chapters 12 forward. You'll see Christ in the church being persecuted by Satan and those who are aiding him. And then ultimately, as we've been repeating throughout this morning, we'll see the victory that comes at the end. All right, hopefully that's enough to at least get us thinking the right way, get our minds kind of engaged. And then, Lord willing, now when we come back Wednesday night, I will begin there in chapter 1. It was asked of me on Wednesday if I would do this, so I am doing it, barring any complications. But we're going to, we do the video, and these are always up on the YouTube channel. If you don't watch it live, you can always go back to the YouTube channel and watch them later. But we're also going to do audio of these sessions. So if you miss one, just look back there on the table. And what I'd like to do, rather than do a bunch of those, we'll just make a few of those. And if as you need it, grab it, go home, listen to it, bring it back, sit it back on the table for somebody else to listen to. You can keep it if you want to, but rather than doing dozens and dozens, maybe we'll do it that way. But just look on the table. Isaac, at the conclusion of each service, should have those sitting back there for you. So if you're teaching a Bible class or you're absent, you should be able to grab the audio as well.